across rural America, we are dealing with dilapidated, vacant, and tax-acquired buildings. All communities are dealing with this, and it can be a major struggle. Van Buren is not absent of this. In 2022, the town of Van Buren owned over half our downtown buildings due to tax acquisition. It's a major burden to carry for any municipality, especially a small one with very limited staff. However, in Van Buren, we started looking at this as great opportunities for redevelopment in our community. And we're fortunate in Maine to have a new entity that helps us navigate taking control of these buildings and turning them into something fresh and new for our communities rather than a missing tooth on Main Street. So I would like to introduce Jen Littoral from the Maine Redevelopment Land Bank.
Thank you, Luke. And we were thrilled that your town was our first project that we got to work on. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Jennifer Littoral, the Deputy Director of Maine Redevelopment. The first thing I wanted to note today is that all the conversations you're having today, they can lead to really important things because, in fact, Maine Redevelopment came out of conversations from a Build Maine conference years ago, which is kind of exciting. We're thrilled today to welcome CCP, Center for Community Progress, to Maine and to introduce our speakers today. Center for Community Progress is the nation's leading organization focused on vacant property revitalization. Over this last year, Maine Redevelopment has been focused on its programs, and we partnered with Center for Community Progress. Over the last few months, they have been talking with communities across the state of Maine to help us understand the challenges, the gaps, and the opportunities with our vacant, abandoned, and environmentally contaminated properties across the state. Today's presenters bring an incredible depth of experience to this work. Liz Kozub, who's the Associate Director of Technical Assistance at Center for Community Progress, previously established a nationally recognized TRICOG land bank in Pennsylvania. This is considered a model of land banking across the country, this land bank. Joining her is Kim Graziani, my sister in shoes today. She is the Senior Advisor for CCP and leads their national program supporting more than 300 communities across 35 states and maybe now 36? Okay. And is widely recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in vacant building revitalization. Before I turn it over to Liz and Kim, I just want to take one quick second to introduce Maine Redevelopment's new Executive Director, Scott LaFlame. Many of you probably already know him. Scott will be joining us in July from the town of Yarmouth, where he's been serving as town manager. He brings extensive experience in redevelopment, economic development, brownfields, and municipal leadership. Huge shout out to Tuck O'Brien for bringing us through our first chapter of Maine Redevelopment, and we're excited to welcome Scott LaFlame to our next chapter. Scott, if you want to do a stand up and wave. There you are. There he is. Stop by our booth later today to talk to us about your stuck and vacant properties. Now turning over to Kim and Liz.
How we doing? Okay, awesome. Cool. Well, thank you all for being here. We're so thrilled to be in Maine. We picked a very good week in terms of weather, so thank you for welcoming us with the sunny weather. And unfortunately, we don't have a vigilante superhero story that talks about a desire to address systemic vacancy and tackle the challenges with delinquent tax foreclosure. That was really awesome and fun to hear from Sarah. But Kim and I will do our best in the absence of that incredible work. Ooh, so some of our font's gonna be messed up, but that's okay. So Jen already introduced Kim and I. Just want to share, I've been with the Center for Community Progress about 8 years, but prior to coming on board, worked for a council of governments that served a number of smaller communities, former industrial communities in Southwest Pennsylvania. I got my start in this work at vacant property, working in a community of 3,000 folks. We understood the need to be scrappy when there's not a lot of resources, but when there's big challenges ahead. I really loved Christina's tagline of like, it's okay to think big. And I'm really hoping that as we're going through this conversation, we're talking about the opportunities that land banks have brought to communities across the country, we embrace that mantra of like, let's think big. These are big challenges, there's limited resources, but what can we all bring to bear to really see the vision that we have for our communities? Okay, cool. All right. Our organization, national nonprofit, helps communities focus on vacant and abandonment challenges. We span the spectrum of how do we help communities prevent vacancy from happening. That's the goal, right? Like, we don't want to be involved in addressing problem properties in the community. Ideally, individuals and property owners have the resources to do that work, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And so what happens when a property does become vacant and it starts causing harm? That's when it's really important to think about what tools, programs, and partnerships can really be applied to address those properties so that we bring them back into productive use or potentially transfer the properties to new responsible ownership. So our organization works all across the country. We have various kind of expertise spaces that we bring to this work. We'll talk a little bit about how this applies and why it's important, especially as we're working with Maine Redevelopment. But really foundational to thinking about strategies to address vacancy is really understand, like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Some of that includes, like, how many properties are we trying to address that are causing issues in our communities? What types of properties are those? Who owns the properties? Do they have clear title? Really getting an understanding of kind of that whole scope of the issue that is impacting your community. We work in places on code enforcement. Code enforcement officers are some of the most underappreciated community public servants there are. They are on the ground really understanding those neighborhood level challenges and interacting with the public in a way that can sometimes be challenging. But they have a lot of knowledge and opportunities to be leveraged to prevent vacancy from happening, but also legal tools that could compel property owners to bring their properties back into a state where it's not causing harm. We work on tax enforcement, super sexy topic. I know everybody loves it. There is certainly been a lot of changes related to how delinquent tax are enforced across the country, but also here in the state of Maine. But it's a really powerful legal tool for communities to leverage when there needs to be that transfer of property. And then lastly, land banking. We support the National Land Bank Network, which has over 350 land banks across the country. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But we wanted to start with this. Time is the worst enemy of vacant properties. And it really is the mantra of how we at Community Progress help municipalities, counties, other local governments, and their partners think about the most effective strategy to addressing vacant and abandoned properties. And it really is through this framework of fix it up, pay it up, or give it up. First, you gotta fix up your property. It's really important for the health and safety of the folks that are in it. It's really important for the health and safety of the folks that are around you. So what are the tools communities have to try to enforce that properties are at a certain standard? When that doesn't happen, what opportunities are there for local government to step in and try to address the issues? So there's some responsibility on local government, not responsibility, but the need to address properties that can happen through abatement, through demolition. That costs the public a ton of money. And taxpayers really shouldn't be footing those bills for private owners that can't address their properties. And so there needs to be some mechanism to pay back the local government and pay back the taxpayers for the money that's been invested in that. And that can come through liening properties, billing owners, putting it as a special assessment on tax bills. But ultimately, if that's not paid, the property is causing significant harm, there should be some way to compel the transfer of that property to new ownership so that it could be reused in alignment with community goals. All right, our work with Maine Redevelopment. Jen covered much of this, but we typically start with understanding what's on the books in terms of state statutes, what's on the books in terms of local ordinances, and then how are those actually being applied? Because we know there's a difference between what's written in the law and then how it's actually implemented on the ground. We're going to be helping Maine Redevelopment think about how to adopt best practices related to the various programming that they've identified as part of their strategic plan. And then ideally finding opportunities for everybody in this room to be involved and engaged in the process. Maine Redevelopment cannot do this alone. These are significant undertakings, and so what as developers, what as funders, what as philanthropy, and the role of revitalizing communities. So for our conversation, we're gonna talk about vacant properties and land banking. Kim's gonna share some inspiration from the field, and then we'd like to have a conversation if time allows. We wanna share back some of the things we've learned from our conversations with stakeholders, but importantly, we wanna hear from you too. I'll share that this is like a teaser because we have limited time. Our team will be here all day today, so we're hoping if anything is of interest or you wanna dig deeper into something that we've shared, please find us. Kim and I are here. We have two colleagues, Monica and Kaylin, in the back of the room as well. All right, vacant properties. I'm assuming you are here because you understand vacant properties harm communities. And that's why Build Maine took the action to create Maine Redevelopment. But important things just wanted to highlight is it's not just the tax revenue that's lost and the municipal instability that can happen. Vacant properties have really significant harm on community members in the neighborhood in terms of market values of neighborhood. When you're living next to a vacant property, it can impact your equity in your own home. It can also be an attractive nuisance for crime, for folks breaking into properties, for stealing pipes, all of that. And it really, as kind of the cycle of vacant properties, those communities with the least amount of resources often have to spend the most to address the vacant properties because they're responsible for doing demolition, not collecting those taxes. It's an ugly cycle that can happen. These are hypothetical examples. We really encourage communities when they're thinking about ways to invest in vacant property interventions to really understand, like, what is it costing now? What is this particular property in our community costing us, and what's the cost of inaction? So again, part of it is that tax money that's not being collected by the municipalities. It could be abatement costs for demolition or boarding up the property. But in many communities, there's a huge cost to public service. Police are going out to the properties. Fire is happening at the properties. So we really help and encourage communities to think of, like, what is the true cost of this? And what's it gonna cost to fix it up? And how can we make sure that there's benefit there? And the important thing is, like, we gotta break the cycle. At the end of the day, we can't let these properties continue to harm our communities, and that is why land banks were formed across the country. So I mentioned Community Progress is the home to the National Land Bank Network. There's over 350 land banks across the country that exist by state statute. You'll see in the pie chart, if you can read the numbers, they're kind of small. Most of them are at the county and municipal level. Maine Redevelopment's pretty unique. There's about 3% of land banks that exist at the state level. And the enabling legislation that created Maine Redevelopment certainly gave a lot of land banking powers, but it's also created as a redevelopment authority. So it has a potentially different, unique role while still being able to leverage some of the key powers and tools that land banks across the country have benefited from. When Kim talks about some of the inspirations from the field, you'll see they're really local. And that's one of the things that our team has appreciated so much about working with Maine Redevelopment is a real, true, authentic desire to understand local municipal needs and really being able to develop their foundational program to address those needs at the hyperlocal level. About 30% of land banks inventory is in rural communities. So when folks hear about land banks, they often think Detroit, Flint, Cleveland. Certainly they exist, they're the biggest ones, but about a third of land banks are working in smaller communities. And the vast majority of land banks get their inventory from the property tax foreclosure pipeline because of that really critical link between vacant properties, tax delinquencies, and needing an end user at the end of the day. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Kim.
Okay, so I'm hoping to give you, like Liz said, a little teaser of some inspiration from the field. And this is really based on some of the conversations we've been privileged to have already. So just picked a few different topic areas. So affordable housing. I'm assuming that most folks in the room are struggling with affordable housing challenges. Each of these slides is going to give various examples, and I have a QR code at the end with a ton of research publications so you can learn more about each and every one of these. But I wanted to just highlight the second bullet, which is Land Bank's partnership with community land trusts. CLTs have come up quite a bit in our conversations here, and they've actually come up quite a bit across the country. There's a lot of confusion about what a land bank is and what a community land trust is. We have some great graphics that kind of break that down, but essentially, hopefully you know what a land bank is by now, but a community land trust is really usually a nonprofit organization that holds land in perpetuity to keep that housing, commercial, mixed use affordable. So leveraging the power of a land bank to get properties through the tax foreclosure process quicker and cheaper, to then hand it off to a community land trust so that land stays permanently affordable is probably the greatest use of public subsidy. It stays for generations to come. Central Ohio Community Revitalization Corporation is really interesting. They're the only ones that have a land bank that actually created a legal subsidiary as a community land trust. And there's sort of pros and cons to that. Rehabs. Again, I think a lot of the folks that we've talked to across Maine are realizing that part of the affordable housing crisis is preserving the homes that you have now, right? Instead of demolishing and building new. So there's quite a few examples of some great work that land banks are doing, but I wanted to talk about the third bullet, which is community development financial institutions, CDFIs. How many folks know or work with the CDFI? Okay. So CDFIs, just so everyone knows what it is, created in the 90s as a mechanism, a financial institution that basically provides much more flexible, less risk-adverse funding, loaning, capital for underserved communities. So think of them as a non-traditional bank that provides more, I would say, traditional lending and underwriting would deem more risky. So home headquarters in New York, they serve various central New York, upstate New York communities. Several land banks in the area. They were providing purchase, construction, financing to do some rehabs throughout the city of Syracuse in Onondaga County. They then were hearing that they didn't have enough smaller scale developers who lived in those neighborhoods. They couldn't get access to capital. A lot of interest from people who wanted to rehab the property next to them, approach some different local and national banks, just didn't quite have all of the points and history to be deemed, I would say, appropriate for capital. And so the CDFI home headquarters actually created its own program called the Equitable Ownership Program. So in addition to providing acquisition, construction financing, they've also added mortgage financing, provide technical assistance, and serve as a one-stop shop for small-scale developers. They work with them and pair them with a land bank to acquire the property. They then assign them a construction manager to kind of work with them to figure out the specs, align the capital stack to help them actually get through the construction piece of it. And then many times they actually live in the unit, and sometimes it's multi-units, and they rent one out for income. I just think it's a good example of, looking at all of the issues of workforce development, affordable housing, and just really accessing that finance gap. Brownfields. How many folks have brownfields in their communities? Yeah, that is what we've heard. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the second bullet, which is folks have heard of this place called Flint, Michigan? Yeah. Has lost a lot of population over the years. It's actually where our organization, Community Progress, was started. I'm sure you're not surprised by that. That's where a lot of vacancy and abandonment has, unfortunately, not started, but it's been there for a while. They've been doing some really great things. And there was a 60-acre Superfund site. 60 acres along the Flint River that was home to about 18 different
General Motors production facilities. GM left. This massive opportunity that would seem so daunting for most people, all through partnerships. The city of Flint worked with the Land Bank Authority to acquire the land. They partnered with the EPA to do some assessment cleanup funds, were able to actually cap the site, plant some low-mow grass, do a 7-year community planning process in partnership with the University of Michigan, with philanthropic and state funds with C.S. Mott Foundation. This Superfund site is now the first state park in Genesee County, Michigan, which is, I think, a huge success. And lastly, commercial redevelopment. I'm gonna talk about the first one because it's a catchy title, Making Beer Out of Blight. So there's a community in southwestern Pennsylvania, tiny town called Jeanette, about 8,000 residents. There is a corner anchor department store that every single person in the community who grew up there knows. It was called Gillespie's. 18,000 square feet. I'm sure you all have those sort of anchor department stores or stores that were part of your main street that no longer are sort of obsolete right now. 30 years of it being vacant, not able to attract any kind of development. Pennsylvania has a pretty easy tax foreclosure law in the sense that if the property goes up for tax sale once and doesn't sell, then a land bank is actually able to put a bid on the property to get it. So this Westmoreland County land bank, this property was $58,000 in debt. And what it would cost to rehab it is obviously underwater. It didn't make sense for most private developers. They bought it for $1,500 through this tax sale, partnered with the state, the county, and some federal to do some stabilization. They used what's called Act 152 in Pennsylvania. They have a $15 recording fee that goes to demolitions for every deed and mortgage that gets recorded in the county. They used some of that funds to demolish the adjacent building, then used funds to demolish the shanty building across the street. You now have this incredible facility that has brewing, distribution, tap room, all of that kind of stuff. Great example, again, of partnership, really utilizing a land bank's unique niche powers, right? Getting those properties through the tax sale, and then just partnering. Okay.
Alrighty. So we've been connecting with a lot of folks so far, and we've been in virtual conversations with folks at the municipal level, with a number of the Council of Governments, with regional planning organizations. We are here all week in Maine doing a grand tour, which is lovely, and of course have been connecting with the Maine Redevelopment folks on a regular basis. And so we want to take some time just to reflect back some of the information that we've heard, and then also hopefully talk through some questions that we have that we're hoping to learn as part of this conversation together. So first, I mentioned property data is so foundational to developing a strategy to figure out what to do with vacant properties. One of the significant sources of property data is at the local level. In terms of where are the properties, who owns them, how do we find that information, and it can take resources to kind of gather that and figure it out. That's especially challenging for a statewide organization that is being really intentional and thinking strategic about how they might be able to support municipal needs across the state, and those needs vary. And so that's one of the barriers that we found of like, there's an opportunity to better understand what the challenges are of vacancy across the state. Certainly, anecdotally, we've heard quite a bit around the brownfields that are in communities that are large, derelict properties causing challenges. We've also heard about those residential properties that are sitting vacant, causing harm that communities are struggling to deal with. And main streets have come up too, of both how do we incentivize or compel business owners to get reoccupancy in properties, whereas those properties might be obsolete, they might not be up to code, there might be significant repairs that are needed. So we've got a lot of anecdotal information. We're hoping to gather a little bit more quantitative information to help think through what that plan could look like. We've also heard quite a bit from communities that they would like earlier intervention tools. So we are talking about those properties that are, as our friends at Maine Redevelopment are in the pit of despair. Like, they are really challenging properties. But in an ideal situation, there's intervention points before we get there. And communities have been eager to understand what those intervention tools are, especially in Maine as a strong home rule state. So what are the various opportunities that municipalities can leverage to intervene earlier? Of course, that takes resources and capacity in terms of having those staff to investigate that, legal support to do that work. I should have mentioned I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I understand, like, when the winters are cold, that impacts a vacant property, and that could be kind of the kiss of death going through one winter with a property that's not having any resources and care. So when we say time is the worst enemy, we truly mean it. Like, there's a need to intervene on these properties earlier. We've heard great stories too. Luke introduced us from Van Buren. They're doing some really creative things, a smaller community, and so there is different innovations that are happening across the state of Maine that we're hoping to share as part of our work. Tax foreclosure again, yay! It's constantly changing. It has changed for you all in terms of the state legislation around how communities can enforce delinquent taxes. For those that don't know, this was because the Supreme Court heard a case and made a ruling around how surplus equity in properties need to be given back to the property owner. It required 12 to 14 states change how they do tax foreclosure, and the state of Maine was one of those states. And it's new, it's a new system, and I think that communities are learning how to make sure they go through the system in a way that complies with the state law and with the Constitution, but also that they're also dedicating the capacity needed to do that work. And we've been so incredibly impressed by the amount of collaboration that is happening across the state. The fact that there was statewide committees that were convening organizations of similar missions and complementary missions to really think through redevelopment challenges across the state. Kim and I work in a lot of places, and that's really unheard of. And so that's a huge asset and benefit to being in Maine and having those relationships. It's a small town community, and focus on collaboration that we've been incredibly impressed by, and there's a lot that can be leveraged to move some of this forward. And lastly, folks are excited about Maine Redevelopment. You all created it. It is an entity that can provide a lot of support to address some of the needs that your communities have. And there is also a lot that Maine Redevelopment can do. There's unique tools that they have in their toolbox. They can have bonding capacity. They can function as a land bank. They can function as a redevelopment authority. They can share resources across the state. And so part of our charge is helping to clarify their role and how they can help so that when you all have a challenging property in your community, you know what you can ask Maine Redevelopment for, or what makes sense to reach out and have a conversation to see if it might be a project that they could support you with. All right, I thought I had these on animation, but I don't, so try not to get bogged down in the amount of words on the screen. But we'd love for this to be a little like Q&A, question with the audience, around your respective needs and maybe some work that you're doing in your community that's working well. That's a part of our role too, is to identify The strategies that communities are piloting, testing out have been long-held strategies that have really seen some progress to address vacant properties. So first, we'd love to understand, like, what are some of the barriers you all see in your respective places to addressing properties? This can be legal, it can be data. Like, what data do you wish you had, or systems did you wish you have access to understand that?
I've got a microphone out
Oh,
here, so I
lovely.
will take care of the audience.
That's great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Kevin Sutherland. I'm a town manager in Newcastle, Maine. We acquired a parcel in tax foreclosure, and our select board decided to keep it for municipal use under the new law. So there's confusion about, or it'd be nice if the state would consider revising that to define what municipal use is, because we would like to do our own housing project on the site. We've been exploring that, but the question is, how do we maintain municipal use with a housing project? Would we be able to create a community land trust and gift that to the community land trust without violating that municipal use rule? So there's some clarity there that would be phenomenal if we could have some help figuring out, because we can't do it alone.
Thank you. We have heard another community at least mention that clarification on the municipal use, so duly noted.
We've got one over here. Carrie will be right there.
So in my city, we recently developed a vacancy ordinance, but it hardly has any teeth. So when we were kind of developing the ordinance, there was a lot of going back and forth. I think part of it maybe stemmed from like education. So I think what would be really great to see is assistance with ordinance creation, especially if people are trying to do more on the vacancies that are within their communities. I know ours technically was supposed to go back to like policy because our city council recognized that our ordinance was flawed in some ways. So I think assistance with ordinance creation and whatnot, because those are ultimately the things that municipalities are probably going to try to use to kind of enforce, to try to get, people who own the property to do something more about it. So I just think ordinance assistance would be helpful.
Great. And it's so important because we see too many communities just copy and paste what another community has done. And I swear sometimes they don't even take out the name of the different state or city. So yes, we hear you.
I just wanted to add one thing about the ordinance creation too, and I think that could be helpful is like, what are the goals of the ordinance and how do you all measure success? Because I know a lot of the vacant property registration ordinance, there's a fee attached and, a community can collect the fee. And is that success, or is the success really getting the property reoccupied? And so making sure the ordinance is crafted in a way that's actually going to get to the outcome that your respective community is looking for. Thank you.
Any other question?
Cool. We have about 5 minutes, so
Yeah.
let's go down to another one. 10 minutes. Okay. Let's start with the last one, because I think it's critically important for this conversation of what tools and partnerships would be most valuable to you all. And then if you're feeling good about it, what role should Maine Redevelopment play in helping to bring that to your community?
So I was going to ask this question, so thank you for skipping ahead to the section I want to ask.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, based on the conversation at lunch yesterday about the TIF financing, about partnering or pairing the land banking to get properties on tax rolls and potential for TIF to help achieve some of these redevelopment components, and what role Maine Redevelopment can help streamline that for smaller communities that need the technical assistance.
TIF support for smaller communities for Maine Redevelopment. Got it. Any other ideas or support that might be needed in your community?
Thinking about those delinquent properties and pairing up or finding good, responsible, small-scale developers, even if they don't exist yet, how do you train them up and provide them an opportunity to take over those properties?
There's also another example that we'll get to the QR code from a community and a land bank that basically started a really small scale construction crew and maintenance crew that then they did a lot of training, mentoring, and I think 93% of all of the folks who went through that are now actually doing some small scale rehabbing development in the community. So I think there's a few creative ways that you could start pretty small to get to a pretty great result.
Hold on.
Hi, I'm Tracy Gear. I'm a state legislator and I co-chair the Housing and Economic Development Committee. And one of the things that's been interesting listening to this conversation is I think it would be really helpful to have some clarity about the role of Maine Redevelopment vis-a-vis the Maine Office of Community Affairs. So the Maine Office of Community Affairs, MOCA, is an office that we created in the administration of state government. It's currently headed by Samantha Horn. And its role is really to bring together all of the functions in state government that were supposed to be there to support municipalities and people doing this kind of work in their communities, because they were sort of scattered all over and there was no policy home. There was no place where that existed that was sort of a one-stop shop. And so I think some clarity when I hear things like model ordinances, help with housing development, I really think it would be helpful for people to understand when it's appropriate to say, Maine Redevelopment, that's where I should go for this kind of help, versus maybe I should be calling the Maine Office of Community Affairs because they're developing the resources and the information and the data that can also help me. And I'm not saying those things should be in competition. I know in my own head, I'm going, this is not clear to me as I'm listening. So that would be super helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great point. And a part of our charge is to also make sure Maine Redevelopment is not being duplicative. There's a strong understanding that there's a lot of resources and expertise in the state. So how can Maine Redevelopment fill those gaps? We've heard a lot from communities of the leveraging MOCA and the benefits that they bring. We have conversations with some of those folks later this month. If anybody from MOCA is here, let's chat, but we'll probably chat virtually in a couple weeks.
Oh, I have a question. I think this one is perfectly squared for you. I'd like to see somebody come up with a template system for historic tax credit agreements, because I think when we're doing very small scale projects, having a $30,000 legal bill is almost unbearable. So that's something I would love to see put out there and someone work on, because I don't think that that's happening yet here.
Good point, Vanessa.
Do we have any others?
I think that's it. Okay, let's thank our speakers,
Thank
Jen,
you.
Liz.